CU-1-18, the conditional use. And-
Yes.
Do you need a moment? Sure. So we'll convene the second public hearing for the evening, which is a continuation of the hearing on CU-1-18, the conditional use application, and CU-2-18 for a major excavation for the construction and operation of the Titan well pad, 6189 Bollinger Road. So with that, we will reconvene the public hearing. Do we have an extra chair so we can have counsel?
Rudell's vacating, so we can take her chair.
Okay.
You can have my microphone.
Condensation from that.
Proceed. Good evening. Again, my name is Pierce Richardson. I'm an attorney with the K&L Gates firm representing Huntley Huntley Exploration, HEX, in its conditional use application for the Titan well pad. We covered a lot of ground at the initial public session of the public hearing last month. We've got more topics to cover tonight. We're going to present 3 additional witnesses. And we have, first, before we do that, I'd just like to introduce a couple of other representatives from HEX who are not here at the initial hearing. Jen Hoffman has joined us tonight. She's a vice president, environmental health, safety, and regulatory with HEX. And we also have Kim Price, who's communications director. And we have 3 witnesses to present tonight. Our first witness is Mike Shelahida, standing next to me, who's with CEC, who's HEX Engineering Company. He is going to address geotechnical issues for you tonight. Next up will be Tom Macenti from CEC, who will give an overview of state and federal regulation of air emissions from well pad development and operation. And finally, Tage Rosendahl, who is HEX sound consultant from the firm Acoustical Control, will discuss the sound study that was prepared for the project. Would it make sense to swear in all of our witnesses now and get that out of the way now? Jen, could you participate in that?
Solemnly swear that the testimony you will give here this evening will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Mr. Richardson, before beginning, I just want to make sure in the party status, we started last meeting, and Protect BT is the party with Mr. Berkovich representing them. Is there anyone else, it may be too late already, but I want to make sure nobody else is seeking party status in these proceedings. Is that correct? Anyone in the audience? And the other thing I wanted to mention, again, is to the extent that there are any citizens' comments, you won't have an opportunity tonight, and you won't have an opportunity at the next meeting for sure as a citizen to provide any comments. You will at the end, as we indicated previously, but certainly not tonight. So, Mr. Richardson.
Okay. So our intention, if we can get through our presentation tonight, will be to come back at your next meeting on July 24th for a presentation from HEX's traffic consultant regarding the traffic study and the proposed traffic mitigation measures. So for our first witness, can you please state your name for the record?
Michael Shelahida,
And Michael, where are you employed?
Civil and Environmental Consultants.
And what is your title there?
I am Vice President and the Corporate Civil Engineering Practice Lead.
Okay.
Sure. Absolutely. Corporate Civil Engineering Practice Lead.
And Michael, what's your educational background?
Bachelor of Science, Civil Engineering from the Pennsylvania State University, and Master of Science specializing in Geotechnical Engineering from the University of Michigan.
And what is your experience in relation to geotechnical analysis?
I have approximately 20 years of experience covering a wide range of geotechnical analyses, ranging from subsurface explorations, real estate, oil and gas, manufacturing, public sector projects, landslide and retaining wall remediations, slope stability, pavement design remediation, fill and unsuitable material assessments, and then construction administration and quality assurance.
And what's your specific experience regarding oil and gas well pad development?
I have been working on the geotechnical aspects of oil and gas well pads for the better part of a decade. My role was typically as either the principal engineer of record or the senior engineer on the development plans.
Do you have any sense of how many well pad development projects you've worked on?
Ballpark, approximately 25.
And what professional certifications or licensing do you have?
I am a licensed professional engineer in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as well as 14 other states.
And have you been qualified to testify as an expert witness in proceedings before?
Yes, I've testified in multiple civil and geotechnical related legal matters.
And we would offer Mr. Shalahida as an expert in geotechnical analysis and introduce his CV as an exhibit. I think we'll follow the same practice and present all the exhibits at the end of the presentation. And Michael, what's your role in with respect to this project?
For this project, my role is predominantly senior engineering oversight to support the civil and geotechnical engineers of record.
Okay, and this is not your first project with HEX?
No, it is not.
Okay. The municipality's saldo, section 201-47H and 201-54M, require an applicant to prepare a geotechnical report to identify soil and subsurface conditions and measures that are needed to be considered in design and development of the project. Did CEC assist in preparing this analysis for HEX?
Yes, we did.
And can you generally describe the process that you go through in conducting that analysis?
Sure. Generally, a geotechnical engineering evaluation includes the following steps. Summarize as concisely as I can. You normally begin with sort of a desktop study where you're researching the published mine maps, the published soils maps, landslide records, and similar publicly available data. Using that information in combination with the proposed site plan, a subsurface exploration is then planned where we would drill and sample soils from various portions of the site. Following the completion of the drilling, the soil samples obtained are reviewed and selected for laboratory testing. Following the receipt of the data, geotechnical engineering analyses are performed. These typically involve assessments of fill suitability, settlements, slope stability, pavement surfacing, and similar. And then finally, we provide formal recommendations to our client as part of a geotechnical report that summarizes the information obtained. The recommendations provided typically address earthwork, compaction, fill materials, slope features, access road, drill pad surfacing, and similar.
And so all that was done here. Can you explain the findings of your subsurface investigation regarding the HEX property?
Sure. The subsurface conditions for the proposed well pad are very consistent and include mine spoil material to depths of approximately, a minimum of approximately 60 feet. That's where we terminated our sampling. The historic documents that we reviewed indicated the Pittsburgh coal seam, if present, would have been approximately 40 feet below the ground surface. So we made a point to go beyond that to confirm that the strip mining previously performed at the site removed the coal seam and appeared to remove the coal seam in its entirety. The gradation of the materials encountered tends to vary, but for mine spoil, it tends to be a mixture of clay soils mixed with the overburden rock materials that are initially removed to access the coal.
Can you explain exactly what mine spoil is when you use that term?
Mine spoil is essentially the material that is removed from the ground in order to access the coal materials at depth. It is then replaced, typically in a relatively uncontrolled manner, back to restore the ground to its original ground surface.
So your conclusion was that through a combination of either the historic demining or strip surface mining, the Pittsburgh coal seam was removed from the site.
Correct.
And did you encounter acid-producing rock in your investigation?
We encountered very limited coal and carbonaceous materials within the samples obtained. These are identified through a combination of both visual metrics as well as laboratory testing to confirm the presence or lack thereof of the acid-producing materials.
So what was your conclusion as to the likelihood of encountering acid-producing rock during the site development?
The likelihood would be limited at best.
In encountering that type of material, that's not unique to an oil and gas well pad development operation, correct?
Correct. Due to the prevalence of various coal seams throughout western Pennsylvania, encountering coal and/or APR materials, acid-producing rock materials, is very common and not limited to oil and gas. The PADEP provides guidance documents on how to address them if and when they are encountered.
And what did you find regarding slope stability for this project?
The slope stabilities provided meet or exceed the typical factor of safety recommended by geotechnical engineers, which is 1.5.
Okay, so is it your CEC's opinion that the proposed site slopes are adequately stable for the project?
Yes.
Okay. And what recommendations did you make regarding fill placement or other kind of geotechnical measures that should be taken during the development?
The recommendations provided included both a recommended width and depth of the toe keys in which to found the proposed fill slopes. We also provided recommendations for the fill material types to use, the minimum compaction requirements to incorporate as part of the specifications, the moisture conditioning of the soil materials, and the preparation of the subgrade prior to the aggregate surfacing.
And I think you mentioned before, but if acid-producing rock materials are encountered, how are those handled, and what determines how those are handled?
They're handled in accordance with the DEP acid-producing rock requirements. Generally, if and when they are encountered, those materials are mixed with lime, and then to treat the potential acid-producing minerals, and then further mixed in with the remaining soils to place at the site. You also tend to want to make sure there is sufficient overburden above those materials so they're not directly on the ground surface.
And what's a typical depth of the overburden that's recommended?
That depth is typically 2 feet.
And did you receive comments from the municipality on your report?
Yes, the municipal engineer provided comments in a letter dated, I believe, December 5th. Those comments were predominantly administrative in nature and were addressed as part of a revision to the report.
Okay, so in response, you revised the report and submitted a supplemental report?
That is correct.
Okay. So we will be moving to admit both of those at the end of the presentation. So all of the municipal comments were addressed, and there were no further comments on your supplemental report?
That is my understanding, yes.
Any questions from council for this witness?
Just a question, and this may not be a question for Mr., well, I go by the first name. I didn't quite get your last name, sorry. But the Midas water contamination at the Midas site, do you see any similarities with this site, or is that not the question for this individual?
That's for a different individual.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
You had said that acid-producing rock and coal is pretty common in this area.
Yes.
At this specific site, I mean, how would you rate it? Is there a lot, a little? Is it pretty average?
I would say it's on the low end at this site. The materials we tested, none of which even qualified for above the DEP threshold.
Okay,
So based on our evidence, as of right now, based on the sampling program we did, there's none. But I can't promise that you won't eventually encounter some as part of the operations.
thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Berkovich?
My name is Anton Berkovich, I'm counsel for Protect BT, a party in this matter. Could you spell your last name for me, please?
Absolutely. DA.
And you testified that you've worked on other projects for Huntley and Huntley before?
Yes.
And you worked on preparation of materials for those projects or application?
Be more specific. I don't understand what you mean by
Was your involvement in the pre-construction phase of those projects, or were you involved throughout the projects?
My involvement is predominantly during the permitting process.
And do you receive information about violations from these sites after they begin operations?
No.
Moving on to your testimony about acid-producing rock, if it is encountered, what are the potential dangers of it entering groundwater?
If it's handled in accordance with the DEP criteria, I would say what was the phrase used? I apologize. Can you repeat the question so I can phrase it properly?
If acid-producing rock is encountered, what are the potential dangers of it entering the groundwater?
If it were to be encountered and is handled in accordance with DEP criteria, I would say the dangers are minimal at best.
What are the dangers if it isn't handled in accordance with DEP criteria?
Then you have the potential for acid-related runoff.
And is that potentially harmful to human health?
I'm not qualified to answer that question.
Is there anybody who's been involved with this project that is qualified to answer that question?
I don't believe any of us have medical-related degrees to answer that question.
And what are the possible operations that it could be encountered? Is this during earth-moving activities?
Yes.
Drilling?
I can't speak to the operational components of their drilling operation.
Do you know if there's any possibility of acid-producing rock being encountered during drilling?
I can't speak to the operational components.
And then you testified if it is encountered, there's certain DEP process to handle that situation, is that correct?
Correct.
How does one determine if it is encountered?
Sure. Generally, the first cues are visual, be it via coloration or potential mineralogy observed. The confirmation would then also be done through laboratory testing to confirm or either the presence of or lack of presence of the materials.
Who's responsible for the laboratory testing?
A geotechnical laboratory would perform the testing.
And who's responsible during earth-moving activities for determining whether acid-producing rock's encountered or not?
The representative of the geotechnical engineer of record.
Are all the workers on site trained to recognize acid-producing rock?
All the workers from which company?
Any company?
I would say no.
Is there any reason why they can't be trained for that?
Beyond, I would say it's infeasible given the geology and the engineering requirements background that would be associated with it.
What are those requirements?
Coursework in geology, previous experience in identifying and the materials.
And there's a plan for somebody with that experience and those requirements to be on site during earth-moving activities?
Yes,
How many?
only one from CEC. I
During,
can't speak to that other companies may also have people qualified to do it.
and is this person making visual observations throughout the whole construction process?
Yes,
And they walk the site? Is that how they do it?
they're on site during earthwork operations as cut and fill materials are placed.
And it's your testimony that they would have eyes on all the earth-moving activities at all times during this?
It's my understanding, and forgive me, I don't know the ordinances exactly off the top of my head, but it's my understanding as part of the requirements that Municipality of Murraysville, a representative of the geotechnical engineer has to be present on site during earth moving.
And do you have any information as to what hours there be earth-moving activities?
That's up to the operations of
Can you tell me typically what it is?
normal contractors work approximately 7 a.m. to 5 p.m.
And then there's no intention of any earth-moving activities outside of that contractor, the one with the training for acid-producing rock recognition, there wouldn't be any earth-moving activities when that individual, the one individual from CEC is on site, is that correct?
Correct.
And so can you tell me more about the process if it is encountered? What are the steps that DEP requires?
The materials are mixed with lime to be treated.
Is that on site at all times?
No,
Where is it?
it's typically purchased.
How long does that take?
It's on the availability to the contractor.
So you don't know?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So it's possible acid-producing rocks encountered, dangerous to human health. You have to get lime, that's a form of the process, but we don't know how long it would take to get that lime mixed in.
Mr. Berkovich, I think he specifically said he's not qualified to answer about the health aspect.
My question was regarding timetable for,
I understand. I just didn't want to put words in his mouth. He is clearly not a medical expert.
other questions at this time?
Question, please. The soil borings themselves, they're done by HEX, the borings?
They were done by CEC on behalf of HEX.
Okay, and CEC does the analysis of the soil borings?
We subcontracted laboratory.
Okay, and they're certified, if you will?
Yes.
Okay. And I did have one, if it's appropriate to ask Mr. Berkovich a question? And just your legal fees?
No, it isn't.
It's not?
Ask one follow-up question. Absolutely. Mike, in your experience, Michael, is it adequate to protect health and safety and to comply with the DEP policy and municipal ordinance requirements for a single qualified geotechnical inspector to be on site during earth-moving operations?
Yes, that is the typical standard.
Thank you.
Mr. Berkovich?
Did HEX bring the DEP guidance document with them today? You have it with you?
On acid producing rock? I believe I do.
Pull it out for me, please. And correct me if I'm wrong, but did you testify that as part of this application, CEC prepared a specific document regarding a acid-producing rock for their application?
I don't understand the question.
CEC prepare any kind of document concerning how to handle acid-producing rock on site?
We provided recommendations within our geotechnical report on how to handle it, referencing the Pennsylvania DEP criteria.
You have it with you?
That's this document right here.
Can I take a look at it?
Sure.
Mr. Berkovich, this is well beyond the scope of redirect, but we don't want to get hyper-technical. We're going to let him go, but if you could try to do this during the first part, because we're going to add another level now, I guess, with redirect that wouldn't be necessary, so. Oh, keep going, please.
Oh,
No,
I thought you were instructing.
Yeah, no, just,
Apologize.
we don't want to get too formalistic, but if you can in your first go at the cross, if you'd cover all that, would make things go faster.
Was this document submitted to the township ahead of time?
Yes,
Do you remember, do you know when?
as part of the conditional use application.
Thank you. No questions?
No, we are going to limit you, Mr. Robinson, so we don't.
No further questions from this witness.
Good.
Our next witness is going to, as I mentioned in the introduction, is going to give council a brief overview of the scope of state and federal regulation of air emissions from these operations. HEX has submitted information regarding air quality in accordance with your zoning ordinance. HEX Hex's position is that regulation of air emissions is preempted under Pennsylvania law because it is fully regulated by state and federal agencies. And we outlined the legal basis of our position in a January 11, 2019 letter to the municipality that we will introduce and admit as part of the record at the end of our testimony tonight. It's Hex's position that the municipality does not have authority to condition its approval of the application or impose any conditions based on matters related to air quality. Yesterday, Hex received a notice from the Pennsylvania DEP confirming that the well pad is exempt from plan approval operating permit requirements under number 38C of the DEP's air quality plan exceptions, and we'll be introducing that as an exhibit tonight. But we thought it would be important for your understanding, particularly since this is the first time you've been through an unconventional well pad conditional use application, to provide you with background information regarding the scope of state and federal regulation. And we'll try to move through this quickly. So, Tom, can you please state your full name for the record?
Sure. My name's Tom Musenti, Muscenti.
And Tom, where are you employed?
With Trinity Consultants.
And what's your position?
I am the regional manager of the Mid-Atlantic region.
And what's your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from John Carroll University and a Master of Science in Chemical Engineering from Virginia Tech.
And you have experience in air pollution control and regulation?
It's correct, approximately 15 years.
And experience with oil and gas well pads?
Yes, approximately the focus has been the last 8 years, but all throughout my 15 years.
And you're a licensed professional engineer, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And have you been qualified to present as an expert witness in proceedings before?
I have at zoning hearings, council meetings, and as part of PA-DEP hearings as well.
So we would offer him as an expert in air pollution control regulation. And have you worked with Hex on prior projects?
Yes, I have, about two to three previous projects.
And can you review for council what the federal and state law, general federal and state laws that regulate air emissions from oil and gas wells?
Sure, there are several. There are new source performance standards for oil and natural gas industries. That is Part 60, Subpart Quad OA of the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40. Those regulate well completion activities, storage vessels, fugitive components like valves and connectors and things like that, natural gas-driven controllers and pumps, and compressors as well.
And are there other federal regulations that apply?
Yeah, so there is the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. That is in Part 63, Subpart HH. That regulates some of the similar operations, the fugitive components, storage vessels, and dehydrators as well.
And how about on the state level?
There are multiple state regulations. There are Chapter 127 of Title 25 regulates the permitting of emission sources, and Chapter 123 are general pollution control standards for all sources in Pennsylvania, even those that are exempt from permitting.
And which state agency administers those permit programs?
That's the PA-DEP.
So air emissions are regulated by the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Can you explain the type of air emission sources that will be involved in developing this project?
Sure. So from a permanent production standpoint, there's going to be small combustion units, storage vessels, some processing vessels like separators and things like that, dehydrators, and kind of your piping, your valves, your flanges, and things like that. There's going to be mobile sources, trucks going to and from the well pad, whether they be hauling water or whether they be personal, worker vehicles. During construction, drilling, and completion activities, there's going to be diesel engines driving pumps and generators and things like that.
Okay. Are there certain types of emissions that are not subject to state regulations but are subject to federal air quality laws or other state regulations?
Yeah, so I mentioned the permitting requirements. So there are certain sources that are exempt from air quality permitting regulations, but there are things that are subject to either federal emission standards, so like mobile sources, the trucks and things like that. You're familiar with tailpipe emission standards. You're familiar with, miles per gallon requirements. Those are federal emission standards that cover those types of sources.
Okay, what about temporary activities relating to well construction itself?
Oh, so I mentioned the engines that are driving the pumps and compressors. So those have specific emission limits based off of the year of manufacture and the size of the engine. And those are mandated at the federal level.
And I mentioned at the outset here that yesterday HEX had received a letter from the DEP confirming that it qualifies for exemption 38C. What does HEX need to do in order to satisfy the requirements of that exemption?
First and foremost, they have to comply with those federal regulations I mentioned earlier. So that's the Quad OA and the HH. They have to implement a leak detection and repair program, so go out and identify if there are any leaks in the components and repair them within a structured timeline. Maintain facility-wide emissions less than some applicable thresholds, and maintain emissions per source below applicable emission thresholds. And then adopt best management practices as applicable to the facility.
And what state regulations will the project be required to comply with relating to fugitive emissions of particulate matter or odors?
So there are a few regulations under Chapter 123. They pertain to prohibition on fugitive emissions into the atmosphere, except for certain sources. And then, can you?
A member in the audience that broke my concentration.
Okay.
Just would ask the audience, our court reporters had difficulty taking that testimony down because of some conversation, so if you would please take any conversation outside. Thanks.
Why don't we just start over with that question? So I think I asked you what state regulations will the project be required to comply with relating to fugitive emissions?
Under Chapter 123, there are provisions against the emissions of fugitive emissions from into the atmosphere, except for certain name sources like construction and roads. As a supplement to that regulation, there are certain provisions related to those activities about construction activities, maintaining fugitive emissions to a minimum, and taking measures to address roadway emissions as well. There are two other regulations related to fugitive emissions and visible emissions at the property line. So it's preventing fugitive emissions at the property line from crossing over the property line, as well as malodors at the property line. And there are generally applicable visible emissions. So visible emissions, the opacity, the smoke, regulations that are generally applicable across all sources in Pennsylvania.
And are there also requirements to control dust?
Yeah, so that I mentioned there are measures to reduce fugitive emissions from exiting the property line and maintaining stable roads and those types of measures as well.
No further questions? Are there questions from council?
As far as 38C, the exemption, what are you exempting from?
You are being exempt from requirement to obtain a permit for that source or for that facility.
So, okay.
An air quality permit.
So you're not being required to, and now the exemption is being granted by the state DEP?
Correct. And it's actually a conditional exemption. So you are exempt from obtaining an air quality permit, provided you do these steps, which the department has outlined in a guidance document and were part of the submittal to the department for their review and approval.
Okay.
Any other questions? Absolutely.
Was there a request for determination made on this? Is that what the letter you're referring to is the result of?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You said there's, excuse me, there are measures required to, reduce fugitive emissions. I don't know, I'm not familiar with it. What kind of measures are taken?
So if you imagine a paved road or an unpaved gravel road that, you know, when if it doesn't rain, but, you know, but if it's hot and dry, you know, apply some sort of dust suppressant in there so that if a truck comes up, it doesn't kick up a bunch of dust. And you know, that's just one example of many, but that's of you know, the operations of a well pad, that's probably one of the main ones.
You know, I think of fugitive emissions, if you have a storage facility and then it starts leaking fluid or odor, and I would imagine then there's devices to alarm if it senses a leak, is that?
Yeah, so one of the requirements in the federal rules and in Pennsylvania rules that's actually more stringent than the federal rule is to go out with an infrared camera and look for leaks from those types of activities and then repair those to make sure that they don't leak again.
Okay.
Mr. Berkovich?
Evening, Council. My name's Ryan Hamilton. I'm co-counsel with Mr. Berkovich this evening, and I'll be cross-examining.
Mr. Hamilton,
Yes.
good to see you again. I just want to mention it, don't want to limit the challenge to the experts. So if you have any challenge or some limited voir dire, would be glad. I don't want to restrict that, but I also don't want to get too far afield in folks that clearly have some expertise in the area and are being offered for a limited purpose. So if you want to challenge, you know, please do.
Thank you. Mr. Musini, you had mentioned that there's a process that an applicant would go through to qualify for the exemption 38 criteria. Could you explain that process in a little more detail?
Sure. So actually, the very latest exemption, which is exemption 38C, there actually is no formal submittal to the department that's required. What is required is for an applicant or an operator to submit annual emissions to the department. And those are publicly available, and they're done every year. So that there is no application process for that, but HECS submitted something to address all of the concerns in exemption 38C to the department for their review, and they received approval yesterday.
And since approval has been received, those emissions, those are estimates. Site hasn't been constructed yet, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And once the site is constructed, are estimates submitted or are actual monitoring data collected?
Annual emissions are reported to the department every year by March 1st.
And are they actual emissions at the site, or are they estimated emissions? Is there any monitoring done at the site to evaluate those emissions?
Yeah, so I mentioned the infrared camera work. That's included in the emission estimates. Records of throughputs and compositions. That's all taken into account when we're reporting actual emissions. So what we presented to the department was an estimate, and what will be submitted to the agency on an annual basis will be what was actually done.
No actual air samples are collected on the site, correct?
Air sampling So you report to the department the emissions. Air sampling wouldn't necessarily be a way to show what those emissions are.
What would be the, never mind, thank you. Mr. Museni, the testimony that you provided this evening, was it based on the air quality study that Trinity Consultants had prepared as part of the application?
It was based off of what general regulations are applicable to natural gas operations, so it would be analogous to that, yes.
You're aware of the air quality study that Trinity submitted?
Yes.
Of course,
Yes,
okay.
I am, yes.
Great. Do you happen to have a copy of that study with you?
Objection, this is beyond the scope. We did not bring up the air quality study in our direct.
I believe that he just testified that this is not so sure. He said it's really analogous. So at least, I don't know if he directly based it on it, but whatever he submitted was based on analogous information. I think it's fair to question. If it isn't, if there's something that's different from what you submitted or relied on, then you can distinguish it.
So, okay. Can I answer that question? Or should I clarify my response?
Go ahead, clarify.
So what, the testimony that was given was based off of a proposed well site and what rules are applicable to, what federal and state rules are applicable. That would have been part of any air quality study for any project.
If I'm not mistaken, though, I think Mr. Hamilton's getting to, there are estimates, and then a year later, there's some follow-up with no actual monitoring in between. I think he's looking at the front end of this.
Okay.
So somebody, I guess Trinity and you, did this application based on estimates. Is
That's
that fair?
correct, Mr. Siddig, yes.
So I think it's fair. I don't want to get hung up on Trinity, but he's asking about estimates.
So if you'd indulge me, I have a copy of the air quality study here. I'm happy to share my copy if you don't have one.
Can I just take? Not that I don't trust That's the response letter.
There's tab 11 of the application.
Oh.
Can I ask if it's the one that I provided to you on the or pulled from the website?
I mean, this is, it's dated August 15th, 2018. To Laura Karasik at Huntley and Huntley. I'm sorry. I said it was to Laura Karasik at Huntley and Huntley. Mr. Museni was copied on it. Trinity Consultants prepared this air quality study for the Titan well site.
Mr. Museni, do you recognize it?
Yeah, yes, I do recognize.
Let's go.
It, yeah, okay.
Okay,
Yes.
thank
you.
And I'd particularly turn your attention to Table 1, which is on that page there in front of you. And I believe this is, would you agree that these emissions estimates here are similar to what would be submitted as part of the exemption 38C qualification?
They would be similar. I don't know that they would be identical, but yes.
Okay. And these emissions estimates here, are these for all phases of, construction, drilling, completions, and production at the well pad site?
No, they are for permanent production operations, which is the exemption 38C.
Okay. So exemption 38C and these estimates here in Table 1 do not contain the emissions for construction, drilling, or completion phases of development?
No, but those are reported to the department.
They're just not reported here to the township. Are truck traffic emissions included in those estimates there?
I'm sorry, Mr. Hamilton.
Yes.
He didn't answer that question, and that was then also almost a statement of fact that you put in.
Sorry,
We are not really beyond that. I don't know if anything else was put in. Mr. Museni, is there anything on construction and completion that is submitted to the township or has been? Or is this all operational?
This original report was operational. If I recall correctly, there was a follow-up that included truck traffic.
thank you. And these emissions estimates here in Table 1, are these per well, or are these for all 6 wells that have been proposed?
For all 6 wells.
And if you, I think, turn to the next page of the report, there's a description of existing pollutant concentrations. Have any air quality samples been taken at the proposed well site to inform this?
No.
Are you aware that Huntley Huntley has agreed to conduct baseline air quality testing and ongoing air quality monitoring at well pad sites in neighboring townships?
I am not aware of that.
And the data that is included here, where was that collected from?
They're from state-operated monitors throughout the region, and we use those consistent with the air quality ambient concentration development that the department uses for major projects. So the federal level permitting as opposed to a state exemption permitting.
And just looking at that table, it looks like each of those monitors is capturing one type of pollutant. Is that accurate?
I cannot say no, that is not correct. For instance, there is a Wilkinsburg monitor that does multiple pollutants.
But you've included all of these monitoring locations to give a fuller picture of overall air quality. Is that the intent?
Yes.
And the closest monitor to the proposed Titan site, how close is that?
Approximately 18 kilometers.
Is it kilometers or miles?
The table says the units are kilometers. Oh, sorry. The table says the units are kilometers.
Approximately how far is the furthest monitoring site from the Titan well site?
The lead monitor is about 104 kilometers.
So these air monitoring sites that you're basing the existing pollutant concentrations on are located between 18 and 104 kilometers away from the actual proposed Titan site. Is that correct?
Most of them are less than 30. One happens to be 104 away for lead, which is primarily emitted from lead smelting operations.
Do any of these?
Really? You can qualify it, but he asked you a specific question.
Okay.
Was that accurate?
Yes,
18.
that's accurate. Yes.
Thank you.
Do any of these monitors here capture volatile organic compounds like benzene?
No.
In your experience, is benzene a potential pollutant that's emitted from well pad sites like the Titan site?
It is potentially a pollutant, yes.
So we haven't, at least here in this report, addressed baseline conditions related to VOCs like benzene.
Mr. Hamilton, to the extent this question is going to lead you to say that this isn't compliant with the regs, we're not really competent to even evaluate that, and I'm going to direct counsel that they shouldn't. So if you could give me an offer, the outline of this, and I'm giving you some leeway because we think all of this is preempted, but he did testify as to how it is, and it's fine for counsel to understand that. But if you could give us some kind of an idea of where we're going, seeing that we're not going to get into the actual regulation of air quality.
Yeah, I'll move on, Mr. Sitting, but thank you. When you're developing the, I'm sorry, strike that. You mentioned in your direct testimony that there are diesel engines driving pumps, et cetera, on site during operations, correct?
Yes.
And in other instances, are you aware that Huntley and Huntley has used an electric frac fleet to reduce the use of those diesel engines?
I do not think I was aware of that, no.
If you turn to page 6 of this report here, I believe it indicates it's the underlined section there indicates that predicted emissions from the Titan pad are below thresholds set by the DEP, and the conclusion is then that they're protective of human health. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
And are you aware that in addition to the thresholds set by DEP related to air quality and human health, there are also numerous public health studies that have evaluated the impacts of these emissions?
That's going to be beyond the scope, really. He's just talking about the regulations. It's fine to ask him how the applications are made and whether we, in fact, made them, and it's part of the record, but that's beyond. He's not the expert on the consequences.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you.
Richardson? Counsel?
I had a question, and it may be my lack of understanding. These monitoring points are 18 kilometers and 104 kilometers. Did I hear correctly?
They range from 18 to 104, yes.
You know, if you convert it to miles, 12 to 67 miles away, is that?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so let me state it and then we can move on. But what we're saying is that from the Titan well pad, we're going to be testing emissions up to 60 miles away? So there's something I'm not understanding.
Yeah, what those monitors were doing was attempting to show the baseline air quality.
Okay, the baseline.
Correct.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Got it.
Just, is that consistent with the regulatory scheme? Is that what's done?
Yes, that is consistent, yes.
Any further questions?
Next witness.
Next witness. Yeah, let's put it.
Mr. Richardson, I appreciate you not objecting each question there. You saved us some time and allowed counsel to get some understanding of the process, so we appreciate that.
Okay, can you state your name, please?
Tage Rosendahl, Acoustical Control, Regional Account Manager for the Northeast.
You need a spelling on that? Okay. And place of employment?
Acoustical Control, LLC.
And your position there?
Regional Account Manager.
And can you give us your educational background?
I have a BS in Environmental Studies from Slippery Rock University.
Okay, and what's your experience with sound control?
I have worked for acoustical control in environmental noise mitigating capacity since 2011.
What's your experience regarding development of oil and gas well pads?
I have worked on oil and gas well pads, as I said, since 2011 predominantly. We have done acoustical monitoring, compliance monitoring, noise mitigation, implementation, construction, and noise modeling impact.
And have you been qualified as an expert in prior testimony?
Yes.
Any sense of how many times?
I've testified approximately 20.
Okay. So we would offer Mr. Rosendahl as our expert in noise measurement, modeling, and noise control. And have you worked with HEX on other projects?
Yes.
And can you describe your role on this project?
Yeah, so I have worked in a consulting capacity with HEX to provide them ambient sound level studies and impact modeling, sound impact assessments.
Thank you. So Murraysville Code Chapter 157 is its noise ordinance, and it provides that continuous sound levels in a rural residential district, which is where this property is located, cannot exceed 50 dBA during the day, 45 dBA in the evening, and 45 dBA at night. And the ordinance provides exemptions allowing construction, short-term construction, and oil and gas development to exceed these limits on weekdays during the daytime. So regarding that provision, can you first explain how sound levels are generally measured?
Yeah, they're measured with an accredited sound monitor, and they're measured in decibels.
Okay, and are they measured over a period of time?
Typically, yes.
And so the ordinance refers to dBA. Can you describe what that is and how it's determined?
Yeah, dBA is A weighting, which is the human ear's response to noise. So there's other weights, but typically in environmental noise or industrial noise capacities, monitoring capacities, A weighting is used because of its human response.
Okay. And then under the ordinance, some of the proposed operations are exempt from these requirements. The ordinance defines oil and gas development activities as site preparation, well site construction of a reasonable and limited duration, drilling of the oil or gas well, hydraulic fracturing of the oil and gas well, installation of equipment and apparatus that will be needed to operate the well, and site reservation as exempt from the ordinance's intrusive noise level limits on weekdays during the daytime hours, correct?
Yes.
The subdivision and land development ordinance, section 201-54R, required HEX to provide an acoustic study in this situation to measure existing ambient measurements, provide estimates of noise anticipated from the operations and equipment, and include specific proposals to reduce noise levels. So did you perform a sound study on behalf of HEX?
Yes.
And can you walk us through how that study was undertaken and what the conclusions were?
Sure. So first we did a 72-hour ambient study, which is pretty consistent through most across the industry. The reason we choose 72 hours is because it gives you a long enough period to kind of eliminate some of the temporary short-term rises and falls of it. It gives you a better, clearer picture of what's actually going on over that period of time. So we performed a 72-hour sound study and to determine the ambient sound levels, and then we also performed a sound impact assessment.
Okay. And so how do you determine what the ambient background levels are, sound levels are?
So again, we take an accredited monitor. In this case, it was a Bollinger 2250, BRUELKJAER, Dutch. Bollinger 2250. And so we take that monitor or similar, and we find a location that's applicable. Frequently, they're identified in the ordinance. We set the monitor for a period as defined typically by the ordinance. When it's not defined, we just default to 72 hours. And then we collect the monitor, we analyze the data, we produce a report, and then we come up with the ambient sound level. It's a logarithmic average of the time period.
And when was that study completed on the property?
It was July 20th through the 25th, 2018.
And why was that period longer than 72 hours?
The monitor, actually, the battery pack for the monitor died shortly before completing the 72 hours. It was close, but it wasn't a full 72 hours, so we discussed it with HEX, and they said, redeploy the monitor, get the full 72 hours.
And what did you determine the ambient background level to be?
58.64 dBA.
So your study showed that the ambient background level prior to the project already exceeds the levels permitted by the municipality's noise ordinance of 50 dBA during the day and 45 at night?
That's correct.
The SALDO also requires that the sound study identify what sound levels are anticipated from the project and to propose sound mitigation measures. Did you prepare a report that addressed those requirements?
Yes.
And how did you estimate sound that would be generated from equipment that's proposed for the pad?
We use Brule and Carr. Good, okay. Predictor software, and we take the area information, so receivers, elevations, stuff like that, landowner property boundaries, input that into the software to create a base map, and then we take whatever noise sources for whatever, function is happening on the well pad at that time, plug that in, and then that will predict the noise propagation over that area.
And the anticipated sound that will be generated, that's going to change depending on the stage of the project, correct?
Yes.
And you took that into consideration?
Yes.
And for the sound levels, for your sound modeling, what did you use in terms of the primary equipment that would be anticipated on the site?
Sure. As I said, it was Brule and Carr Predictor, which is a 3D mapping software, which again utilizes multiple inputs, spatial and noise related, plug that in, and we use data that was previously collected from drilling and or frac sites. In this case, we used an HP flex rig for the drilling component and a Pro Petro frac spread for the completions component.
And that's equipment that HEX has used on other projects?
It's similar, yes.
And what were your results for sound, anticipated sound during drilling operations?
During drilling, so what we did was we looked at the most stringent portion of the ordinance, which was 45 decibels at night. So we found that during drilling, all but one location would be in compliance with the 45 dBA.
And when you say one location, what are you referring to?
Location A.
Okay.
And probably a big portion of that is its location towards the entrance.
Okay. And what about during completions?
Multiple receptors were over the 45 decibel levels at that point.
And did your numbers take the ambient background levels into consideration?
No, sir.
And why not?
Because they fluctuate.
Seasonally?
Inconsistencies. Seasonally, daily, weather.
So because sound levels at some receivers exceed the levels authorized by the ordinance, did you propose sound mitigation measures?
I did.
Okay, can you walk the council through those, please?
Sure. So what we proposed that HEX do to mitigate noise was this green line here is the pad perimeter. And what we proposed is that they install barriers on all four sides. These barriers are 32 foot tall with an STC rating of 34, which is standard transmission class, measure of how much noise is blocked by a particular medium.
What's the material that those are made of?
Mass-loaded vinyl. It's a very dense, heavy material. That's why it has excellent noise blocking characteristics.
So that's on all sides of the pad?
Everywhere except the entrance, yes.
And how does that mitigation impact the anticipated sound levels from drilling and completion operations?
Reduce them significantly.
And are there still receivers that could potentially exceed the municipality's noise ordinance during certain times, even with those tall sound barriers?
Yes.
Can you explain that? Which receiver might be affected?
So during drilling, again, receiver A, and then during completions, The 45 decibel level is exceeded on all but G. Q. Where are you, Q? R. S. U. V. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm going into the 55s.
Okay.
Sorry.
In your experience, would any oil and gas operator be able to meet these sound levels even with mitigation measures?
No.
HEX received a comment letter from the municipality sound consultant AVT Inc. asking for additional information relating to your ambient survey and sound impact study. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
We will be introducing that comment letter as an exhibit. You submitted a supplemental 72-hour ambient survey to address the comment letter. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what did the municipality's consultant specifically ask you to do?
They asked, one, why there was a gap in the data, which I explained was because of the battery running out of power. And also, they wanted to know what things were causing sound levels to be elevated.
In your study, and what were those sources you identified in response to that?
We identified birds, insects, planes, automobiles, things like that. They're pretty common.
And AVT also asked for additional data relating to evening and nighttime hours. Did you include that data?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you also include a chart showing typical decibel levels?
I did.
Okay. Do you have that chart?
Sorry, it's a little bit smaller.
It's going to show up or not?
Yeah, I didn't print that, not a big one.
Yeah, it's not going to.
Okay.
You received comments specific to the sound impact study, is that correct?
Yes.
And what were those comments related to?
They were related to methodology, things that we used, information specific to the study. I don't know if you guys can see the typical noise sources, if you can zoom in on that.
Can you review some of those that are around the levels that we're talking about? I mean, a sound level of 40, what does that correlate to?
Sure. So a sound level of 40 is a quiet home, 50, a quiet street, 60 decibels, a normal conversation, 70 decibels inside of a car operating.
So those are the ranges that we're talking about here.
Yeah, we went up to 58, so almost 60, so a normal conversation. A good thing you could think about is just how loud we all just recently had it, cicadas, how loud they can be. So I was actually monitoring recently, and the cicadas were almost 80 decibels.
The municipality received a second comment letter from AVT on dated January 23rd, 2019, is that correct?
Yes.
And the letter stated that you had addressed and incorporated their comments and changes, and they had no additional comments, is that correct?
That's correct.
As demonstrated by Mr. Rosendale's testimony and the comments from AVT, HEX's proposed operations may exceed the sound limits in the ordinance at certain receivers during certain operations. And so HEX is requesting a special waiver pursuant to Section 157.8E of your ordinance. I believe the Planning Commission included information regarding that waiver request in its recommendation. The request is that the waiver apply to HEX's drilling and completion operations conducted during weekday evenings, weekday nights, and weekends, as those periods are defined in your ordinance. And the request would be that the operations may not exceed 10 dBA above the ambient background level of 58.64 dBA LEQ that was set forth in the study. HEX is also requesting adjustments in accordance with the schedule that was included in the requested waiver that would permit an additional increase of 5 dBA for no more than 15 minutes at a time, an increase of 10 dBA for no more than 5 minutes at a time, 15 dBA for no more than 1 minute, or 20 dBA for no more than 1 minute. So we respectfully request that this waiver be included in the municipality's conditional use approval. As I mentioned, it was included in the Planning Commission's recommendation. Any questions from council?
Just go over that one more time. You said 5 dBA for no less than,
15,
no greater than
no
15.
greater than 15.
Greater than 15, 10 for,
5, no greater than 5. 15, no greater than 1. And 20, no greater than 1.
Is there a limit on how, the frequency of those exceedances?
The proposals, those would be cumulative minutes during any 1 hour. This is actually this is a standard that's taken from another municipality's ordinance. That's where that was developed.
So there could be 24 of these in every day of operation.
Correct.
Is the sound wall that you mentioned in terms of material and height similar to or the same, do you know, that's being used in any neighboring communities?
Yes.
Oh, could you repeat that? Yeah, sure. What I asked, and he answered, is if the sound wall that you're proposing in terms of materials and height, sorry, is the sound wall in terms of materials and height the same as what is being used in any neighboring communities?
Yes, so standard heights for these barriers are 16, 24, and 32. Materials are typically some kind of heavy, dense material. Ours is an STC 34, and I work with a lot of other operators in the area, but mine is also the heaviest of the materials that's readily available.
Have your materials been used at any nearby well pads?
Yes.
Neighboring, can you name any of those?
Any nearby well pads?
That your
Sure.
materials are used in?
Sure. Several EQT pads. Fetchin, Oliver East, Oliver West. What else is in the area? Several for Hex, Zeus. Several others. If you want me to go into any other counties, I can. Butler County, Washington Green, West Virginia, Ohio.
Nope, I'm good, thank you.
Canada.
I don't need Canada, thank you.
No problem.
If these are exceeded, like what typically in the other locations, the other wells, if you will, or other sites, what violations or assessments were there? Is it just noted as a violation, and what is the repercussion to that? Is it a penalty? Is there
You're
a
asking,
monetary
you're
penalty?
asking him how other municipalities enforce their ordinances?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
So typically what happens is, if there's a complaint, not logged, then the operator will notify me or somebody like me to go out and monitor for noise for a period frequently defined in the ordinance. Usually it's a period of 48 or 72 hours. So we take sound monitor, we go to the complaint residence, set a sound monitor, pull the monitor, analyze the data. So that's what we would call a compliance study. So we do an ambient study prior frequently, and then after, if there's a complaint logged, then we go out and do a compliance study. In the case of Hex, they continually monitor well pad noise with 1 or 2 monitors that run 24 hours a day, the entire operation.
Well, I can see that if there's, if you exceed, if you will, the agreed to limits, are there penalties? Are there monetary penalties, or?
So basically then what you have to do is find out kind of what those exceedances are, because noise levels, are frequently going to be exceeded. But so all the monitors that we use have recording capabilities. So some monitors will you can set a trigger, say in this case, it would be 45 decibels, which would go off constantly. The wind would blow, it would trigger. Birds chirp at, 80 to 90 decibels. 6 a.m., you start seeing monitors waking up. So you have to go in and look through the data, identify those peaks, and try and identify through the sound clips what that was. If it was operations related, or if it was what we would call a transient noise source, something close. So most often it's anytime that it's something that triggers its high, it's something that's nearby, and it's a short burst. unless it's somebody like, you know, in the summer mowing grass, operating a chainsaw, something like that. So as far as, you know, I mean, monetary, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure that in some places that's probably the case.
I have a question. You mentioned with the prediction software,
Yes.
and just to use point A, I would say it appears to be referenced, it appears to be one of the closer points, the pad. You said during drilling, what was the prediction of the decibel level?
Sure. Without a sound wall, it was 49.34 decibels, and with a sound wall, the STC 34 at 32-foot height, 45.65. Kind of the thing about noise, 10 decibels going either direction. You've heard this before?
Go ahead.
Okay, it's like being twice as loud or half as loud. So if it goes from 50 to 60, the way that we perceive it is it's being twice as loud. So, you know, a 4 decibel reduction is quite noticeable.
And then you said I think you said for completion, you said it exceeded 45, right? What was the prediction, the actual predicted?
At most of the areas, most of the receptors exceeded 45 decibels.
What would that be for completion? What was if it was estimated around for drilling about, was it 49.34 west
Yeah.
south wall?
That was at one location though. I mean, so these are all going to vary because of distance, obviously, elevation, stuff like that.
But at your close point, which I again just to use
So the
for example.
okay, so for example, most ordinances would, you know, probably be in that 55 decibel. That's what FERC says. We have one, which is letter Z on completions, that is outside of the 55. That's the highest, 55.94.
In a prior meeting, we mentioned, what we're looking here with this map, is this all of the property owned by Hex? Or is this beyond it right here, what we're looking at?
So this is 3,000 feet from the center of the pad. So this is beyond the scope of what Hex would own. Correct.
Okay. Like, would you happen to know, the closest to where the mole pad is Scout Knob, or the scouting facility? Does that ring a bell? Would you know where that is here?
No, not offhand. I don't know the name of the
Jim, would you know where that is?
The north on the picture there. I'm sorry, it would be east on the picture there. To the right.
To the right.
Let's see. Further down?
Further.
Almost to the next road.
That small gravel parking.
Oh, way over here?
Yeah, move to your left a little bit.
Right there.
The clearing right there.
Okay.
That's what he's talking about.
That's Scouting Knob.
I thought that's where the scout mob is, right?
Okay.
It's
How many feet? Oh, okay. So here's the pad, and this one? Oh, scouting, yeah, it's almost 5,000 feet away. No, that's not right. 3,052, sorry. 3,052 feet. And that's from the edge of pad, it looks like.
Other questions from council?
How's it going?
Good, how are you, sir?
Living the dream.
This map, do you know where the trucking route for Hex's activities are?
I do not.
And does the sound impact modeling study measure in any way the noise generated by diesel trucks going along the trucking route outside of Hex's property?
No.
And do you know how many decibels a diesel truck by itself generates?
Depends on what it's doing.
Okay, well, what are some values to what are some things that they could be doing?
Driving uphill, it's going to obviously rev higher, so you can easily get into the high 90s.
High 90s for a diesel truck going uphill?
Yeah.
Do you know where the hills are on that?
Nope, not off the top of my head.
Okay, and that's just one truck goes in the high 90s, correct?
Can.
Okay, do you know how many trucks Hex is proposing to utilize?
I do not.
On other oil and gas operation sites that you've worked on, were there more than one diesel truck utilized in those operations?
Yes.
Do you have any familiarity with noise generated by electric vehicles?
Not so much. I
Are you
know they're
able to-
quiet.
Using your expertise, are you able to make a prediction as to whether electric vehicles are quieter than diesel trucks?
I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, I've seen Teslas and they're pretty quiet.
And as part of the ambient noise study, if you're able to tell me, are you able to, is it the red circle that measured the?
No, just the area where the well pad was. We're attempting to get the actual ambient of the area.
How many noise monitors were used?
Just one.
Were any other nearby areas on this map measured to compare to that spot?
No.
And is there an audio recording of that ambient noise study?
There are.
You've reviewed it?
Yes.
It still exists?
I think I can probably track it down.
And you listened to it?
Mhm.
Okay, what kind of noises did you hear?
Birds, bugs, airplanes, ATVs, cars, probably a train. I don't
So,
know.
sounds of human activity and sounds of nature?
Yep.
Were you able to say which one you heard more of?
Depending on the time of day, but birds and insects were the predominant louder.
The most common thing that was heard?
Yes.
So you discussed chapter 157 of Murraysville's noise ordinance.
Mhm.
And 157-1A says maximum noise limits are upper limits, not goals for the community. Is that correct?
I don't think I said that.
No, I'm asking what the ordinance says that you reviewed.
Oh, run that by me again?
Maximum noise limits are upper limits, not goals for the community.
No,
You didn't see that?
I don't remember saying that, no.
Okay. And do you remember if you saw the long-term goal is to gradually reduce noise within the community while maintaining prosperous growth?
No,
You don't remember reading that?
no,
Do you have a copy of the ordinances with you?
not with me, no.
Okay. Does anybody with your team have one?
Do you want me to go get it? Sure. I mean, that's just kind of part of it. Usually what like I said, pay attention to is the actual limits of allowable things, allowable noise levels.
Right, and you're offering an expert opinion as to how this studies that you conducted does or does not comply with the ordinance. Is that correct?
Yes, based on the numbers.
Right. What about subsection B of the ordinance? Can you take a look at that?
Mm-hmm.
You go ahead and read it when you're look up when you're done.
It is accepted that some sounds are inherent and acceptable to the community. Sorry.
You can read it to yourself.
Oh, okay.
Let me know when you're finished.
Yep.
So you'd agree with me, the first sentence is, it is accepted that some sounds are inherent and acceptable to the community, but intrusive noise is not.
That's what it says.
Okay, in your expert opinion, would sounds of nature be acceptable noises to the community? Inherent noises to the community?
That's subjective.
Well, I'm asking what your expert opinion is.
Depends on the person. Some people don't like crows.
And what about intrusive noise? Is that, would you say oil and gas operations would count as intrusive noise?
Again, depends on the person.
Do you live near an oil and gas well?
Not currently.
Have you ever?
Nope.
So not currently also means you never have?
No.
Okay. You talked about sound mitigation measures proposed to other sites that you've worked on, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned that this barrier wall is one of them, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. What are some sound mitigation measures that have been utilized at other sites that are not being proposed at this site?
So typically, because of operations, we are limited to the exterior of the pad perimeter. Usually, that's enough to get things in compliance. We can do other source treating when necessary.
What does that mean?
So if you have a loud pump, we actually put barriers or some kind of buffer around that.
Around the pump equipment, is that what you're saying?
Sure.
And you're not proposing that that's going to be utilized in this site, is that correct?
Not at this time,
Why not?
because we're trying to get a conditional use change, permit change.
What do you mean by that?
That would make it more in like the realm of, as far as the ordinance is concerned, typical with others. This is very, very strict.
So you're seeking, and you can correct me if I miscategorize, what you're just saying is you're seeking permission to go above the noise limits.
Yes.
But there's certain sound mitigation measures that could be implemented, but you're choosing not to implement because this other approach is better for HEX?
No, because the sound levels are already above the ordinance.
Sounds of nature?
Sounds of vehicles, sounds of trains, sounds of planes, those are all above the 45, or can be all above the 45,
All sounds that the community's used to.
potentially.
What do you mean by potentially?
I don't know the community. I don't know the people. Again, it's subjective.
You testified you worked on other well sites for Huntley and Huntley?
Yes.
Was Poseidon one of them?
I worked on the back end of Poseidon.
What does that mean?
I was not involved in the planning of Poseidon.
So what were you involved in?
I provided the noise barriers, and I did some monitoring after the fact, after operations had started.
Why did you do monitoring after the operation started?
HEX asked me to.
Do you know why they asked you to?
I believe because they had noise complaints.
Okay. What were you told about the noise complaints at the Poseidon site? Well, scratch that. Do you know which township Poseidon is in?
Penn.
In Westmoreland County?
Yes.
Okay. And what were you told about the Poseidon noise complaints that merited additional after-the-fact monitoring?
They just said there was complaints, so we monitored.
Were you told how many?
How many complaints? No.
I'm going to hand you a document. Can you take a look at it, and when you're done, can you tell me if you recognize it or not?
Sure.
Sure to recognizing it or sure to my request?
Yes, I recognize it.
Okay, so if you recognize it, can you tell what it is?
It is a map showing the Poseidon well pad with some concentric rings showing the 2,600 40-foot buffer and the 5,280-foot buffer, so a half mile and a mile, and then some landowner complaints, and then parcels.
And have you seen this document before?
Yes.
Did you generate this document?
No, sir.
Did Huntley and Huntley make this document?
No, don't know.
Is there a company logo on this document?
There is.
What company logo is on this document?
Huntley and Huntley.
Is it dated?
Yep.
What's the date?
5/9/2018.
And do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of this document?
No.
And so, I'm gonna go ahead and, I know it's a little small, but I just want to make sure the council sees it before, oh, thank you.
They can blow it up.
Should I flip it over, or should I rotate it, or, okay.
No.
Right. And, so, do you know what the green circle signifies?
The green circle is 1 mile.
1 mile from what?
I don't know if it's the edge of the pad or if it's the pad center.
Well, how much distance would be from, generally, if you know, from the center of the pad to the edge of the pad?
1 to 200 feet.
So give or take a mile, give or take 100, 200 feet from the center of the pad.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
What does the yellow circle signify?
2,640 feet, so half mile.
And the red markings signify landowner complaints?
That's what it says.
So we have landowner complaints within a half mile, is that accurate?
Yes.
And even
Looks
more,
like 1.
and even more, well, one piece of property. We don't necessarily know how many people were there, is that right?
I mean, it looks like, yeah, 1 piece of property, I guess, sure, yeah.
And then we have more complaints within the 1 mile radius, is that correct?
Yes.
And then we have two property complaints outside of the 1 mile radius?
Yep.
Did you investigate these?
The witness is testifying as to what he has seen on this piece of paper, not what he has knowledge of.
Yeah, this is, it's not even, it's,
Document he's familiar with.
I looked at it.
we'll be clear, it's not as to the, he's not testifying as to the accuracy. He's just testifying as to what, he's reading the document as we are.
He did testify he doesn't have any reason to doubt the accuracy.
Of what I'm seeing, that there are landowner complaints that are in red, that there's a line that is the buffer for the mile, the buffer for, yeah.
Have you seen this document before tonight?
Yes,
When?
2 or 3 weeks ago.
Did you use this as a basis for any of your remedial work?
This?
Yes.
No. Like I said, I saw this for the first time 2 or 3 weeks ago.
When did you do post-operations noise monitoring for Poseidon?
During completions,
What, can you give me a date?
not off the top of my head.
Can you give me a year?
2018.
May of 2018?
I'm going to guess April.
2018. And according to what you see, this document was generated in May of 2018?
Looks like it.
So you were asked by Huntley and Huntley in April of 2018 to go out and do additional noise monitoring at Poseidon?
Yes.
Okay, and what kind of noise monitoring did you do out there?
I placed 2 Berlin car 2250s. One may have been a 2270. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at my notes.
I'm sorry.
At residences nearby that were registered as complaints.
Are you able to point on the map approximately where you placed those monitors?
One might have been here and one might have been here.
As the record reflected, the witness identified near these red clusters within the 1 mile range. How long was the monitoring done for?
A few days.
Yeah, could we clarify exactly on the map where you did the monitoring?
It was probably this residence and then one of these ones over here would be my guess. Just looking at it, again, not having seen those documents recently.
When you said a few days, you mean 72 hours?
Longer than that.
Longer than that. And what was your conclusion from the data?
I don't know off the top of my head. It was in compliance. I do know that.
Were any steps taken to were any changes made to the site that you're aware of to address the noise complaints?
Did anything happen on site? Not that I'm aware of, no.
Can you clarify or repeat? You said that when you did the additional noise monitoring, what you found was that the site was in compliance?
Yes,
Okay,
100%.
thank you. I just couldn't hear when you said it.
No problem.
Thank you.
The proposed, I'm going to switch gears for a second, the proposed barriers for Titan, what's the height of them?
32 feet?
Do you ever put up barriers that are higher at other sites?
Not typically, no.
Do you have?
No, we have not. Permanent structures, yes, not temporary.
For the purposes of noise mitigation or the structures? What do they look, are they barriers? Are they walls?
Similar, yeah, except they're heavier material because they're permanent. They're typically what you would maybe see a metal building made out of, sheet metal type stuff with insulation.
Do you know the height that was utilized?
I know that we've done 35-foot tall walls.
Does that reduce noise compared to the 32-foot barriers?
Yeah, I mean, gaining a few feet helps, but it's not really super significant.
Is the reason for that because of the length of the wavelengths?
Can be.
So sound can have a long wavelength, it could have a short wavelength, is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And barriers, these wavelengths, some of the wavelengths hit the sound, oh, scratch that, some of the sound wavelengths hit these barriers and keeps the sound from going outside the barriers.
Correct.
But certain wavelengths can go over the walls, is that correct?
Well, yes. I mean, at certain distances, a noise, heavier frequencies will fall as they cross over. So you have a barrier, and you draw a line, and as it gets over it, it starts to kind of filter down.
Is another factor that affects that the topography, the elevation?
Absolutely.
So would it be fair to say a flat site sound would travel differently, the same wavelengths compared to elevated site?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, depending on the elevation of the receptor or the producer, I mean, things are going to vary.
Would you categorize the Titan site, the red site, the circle, as flat?
No.
How would you characterize it?
Rolling hills?
Moving on to the sound impact modeling that was conducted. You utilize, it's software, right?
Correct.
And a simulation's done,
Yes.
digital.
Yes.
And you used as, the noise models that were used were from an HP flex rig, is that right?
Correct.
That's not an unconventional well pad, right?
It was not, it was a non-conventional well pad, yes. There was non-conventional well pad, yes.
What is an HP flex rig?
It's a triple drilling rig.
And is that what's being utilized at Titan?
I don't know exactly. It's comparable to what's frequently used here, yes.
Not the exact type of well pad that Titan is.
So I think that it's hard to find what exactly is going to be used because of availability of rigs. So while...
Well, availability of the rigs in that software, correct?
No, that data was collected in the field.
It was data provided by software, by the company that the software was purchased by.
No. So a colleague of mine collected the field data, so out in the monitor, or with a monitor, looking at the frequency analysis, and we plugged that data into the software.
To predict what Titan's noise could be.
Correct.
And the data that was collected was from a type of well rig that Titan isn't, an HP flex rig.
It could be.
You don't know if it is?
I don't know what rig they'll end up using on it, no.
Okay. If it is a different rig, should there be another sound impact model?
I mean, you could, but I mean, the frequency, the signatures of a lot of these are pretty close.
Pretty close, but not the same.
No.
At this time, I'd ask to admit what previously had the witness testify. We haven't, Protect PT has not introduced any exhibits yet, so I'm not sure.
Well, at the end of the evening, we'll go through all of them, Mr. Berkovich, so. then
Letter number, or number, lettering?
We'll do them at the end.
All right, no other questions at this time?
Counsel? Yeah, I do have a question. Where, using the predictive software, has there ever been a model completed where any electric source has been substituted for diesel? Has that ever occurred?
Yes.
Do you have any, I don't know if you're prepared for that, do you have any information as far as comparisons of sound readings of electric source versus a diesel or combustion engine?
They're quieter in general. There are sources, so typically an electric frac fleet is powered by a turbine, and so powering the turbine can be loud. I'm familiar with one that's relatively local, and they've still had some noise problems, but in general, it's quieter than a diesel fleet.
Okay, thank you.
Good. All right.
That's it for tonight. We just have some exhibits to enter into the record.
All right, Ms. Gaffner, I think we left off at 18, is that correct?
Yes. I'm a little more prepared this time. They're already here and numbered. So these have all been introduced during testimony. The first one is Mike Shalaheda's CV. I would like to admit that as Exhibit 19, please.
Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Berkovich, any objection? Admitted?
And I have a December 5th, 2018 letter from the municipality of Murraysville enclosing consultant comment letters. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 20, please.
Admitted?
I have a January 11th, 2019 submittal from Huntley and Huntley. It's a supplemental submission for the conditional use application. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 21.
Submitted to the municipality?
Yes.
Admitted?
I'd like to introduce a January 11th, 2019 supplemental submission for the land development site plan application. This was submitted to the municipality.
Sorry, would you repeat that, please, the date?
This is January 11th, 2019. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 22.
Admitted?
I have a July 9th, 2019 request for determination from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to Huntley and Huntley. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 23.
Gentlemen, any objection? Admitted?
I have Thomas Musenti's CV. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 24.
Gentlemen, any objection?
Could you give me a list? Thank you.
It's admitted as 24.
I have a January 29th, 2019 email from the municipality to K&L Gates and Huntley enclosing additional Murraysville consultant comment letters. I would like to introduce this as Exhibit 25.
What were the dates of the letters that were included? Do you have that?
I have, yes. an AVT letter dated January 23rd, 2019, a Core Environmental Services letter dated January 29th, 2019, and a KU Resources letter dated January 23rd, 2019.
So that email with those attachments and those three attachments, which are municipal responses, are admitted as 25. Gentlemen, any?
We have a February 11th, 2019 letter from Huntley and Huntley to the municipality. It enclosed supplemental submission materials for both the land development site plan application and conditional use application. I'd like to introduce this as Exhibit 26, please.
Admitted.
And then the final exhibit that I would like to introduce tonight is Tage Rosendal's CV. I'd like to introduce that as Exhibit 27.
Gentlemen, any objection? Admitted as 27.
That's all, thank you.
Mr. Berkovich, you referenced at least one exhibit. Do you have?
Are we continuing the numbering, so we would be 28?
I think we should switch off to letters.
Okay. We would request admission of facade and noise complaints prepared by Huntley and Huntley, Exhibit A.
That's the map.
Sir.
Any objection? Admitted as A.
That's our only exhibit this evening, thank you.
Okay. All right, so, yeah. Do they have a copy, Anthony? Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. So, council, before adjourning, we ought to keep on the record when we are next going to convene.
July 24th.
At 7 o'clock following.
7 o'clock, what we'll do is, in keeping with our past practice, we will have our regular meeting first, and then we will reconvene the public hearing thereafter.
Mr. Richardson, do you expect to take the balance of that time, assuming it's going to be less than 3 hours? Are you going to, just want to know if they need to start their case in chief?
So we'll have 2.5 hours maybe?
That sounds like that's about right.
So our major topic to cover will be traffic. I don't anticipate that would take that entire time. And then we'd have some cleanup. So they may well get the opportunity to begin.
And it looks like, just to give you an idea of allocating your time too, and if we're adding all that up, it looks like we're going to be in that range of 7 hours, which is sort of the statutory area. So we're probably expecting you to be in that range and to potentially start at the end of the 24th meeting.
With the availability for follow-up hearings.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. We just want to, use the maximum amount of time each night that we can. So you'll have, I would assume after the 24th, you're going to have 2 full nights. What we're doing now is full evenings, at least.
Second Wednesday of August, is that it?
The first and third Wednesday.
First and third, sorry.
Okay.
The meetings this month are skewed by 1 week because of the 4th of July holiday.
Oh,
We
I
didn't want
see.
people to have to come in on the 3rd, so.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you. We'll prepare accordingly.
Yeah, and obviously, when you come in on the 24th, if there's scheduling issues, you have witnesses that aren't available or whatever, if you can be ready and give us an idea so we can schedule. But looks like the applicant's gonna finish its case or be very close to it the next meeting, so.
We'll do everything we can to facilitate it smoothly.
Great. Anything else, council?
With that, the public hearing will remain open and reconvene on July 24th, following our meeting at 7 o'clock p.m. And with that, I think we're through for this evening, so we need one more motion.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The meeting is concluded at 10:09 p.m.